Hey, you want to make a Zone Wars and Boxfights free-for-all map, don't you? Well, of course you do, so why don't we then? Step 1. Make your island or whatever, and once in it, set up your island start area with up to 16 spawn pads. Why? This is where players will spawn in before the game starts, genius. That's why. Step 2. The next step is setting up the pre-round spawn. You want to get a random number generator, an explosive device, and up to 16 spawn pads. After placing your random number generator, you'll be setting it up to send off signals that can trigger events. Signals are transmitted on channels. If you don't care how this works, keep your channel numbers the same as mine and do the bare minimum like you do with all things in life. This generator will roll a value between 1 and 2 every round, and we'll say the winning value is 2. These values represent our game modes. We'll say 1, the losing value, is Boxfights, and 2, the winning value, is Zone Wars. Also, pick each number once to reset on game start, and make sure you set enabled during phase to gameplay only. So we can scroll down to where it says on win transmit on, set it to channel 2, and on lose, set it to channel 1. Now, before moving on, we need to tell this generator when it's time to spit out a value, which we can use another signal to do that. Set this to activate when receiving from channel 3. Also, we can disable it once it's generated a value, just so it doesn't do anything weird when we aren't looking. We'll use channel 4 as our off signal. Next, find a neat looking place to put your player spawn, ideally each spawn in its own individual box, like so. These are where you'll spawn before the actual round starts, and since you only use it once per round, like the number generator, we'll turn this off with channel 4 when we're done with it. Now, when a player spawns, we'll want to transmit the signal on channel 3, which will activate the number generator. It's important to make sure these spawn pads are not set to island start, and that they are set to primary group. Now we'll place the explosive device in the box with this spawn. Your number generator should be set to have a roll time of 3 seconds, and you want your explosive device to detonate about 1 or 2 seconds after the game starts. Start by setting the blast radius to 1.5 just in case, player damage to elimination, structure damage to 0, knockback off, time to detonation from game start, we want a couple seconds after the number generator finishes, so 5 seconds is okay, play audio off, visible during game off, collision off, and towards the bottom, turn play audio off. This device eliminates our player from this area, which means after that, we're done with the pre-round spawn and the number generator. So when this is exploded, we'll transmit on channel 4. Step 3. Now that our player is killed and ready to respawn, this is where we decide where they'll be spawning. Ideally, you would put these spawn pads in their respective Boxfight or Zone War locations, but I'll get to that shortly. I just want you to make sure that these are working before going through all that effort and setup required to do that. Just place a spawn pad, set enabled during phase to gameplay only, and set this one's priority group as secondary, and also turn off island start. Now quickly, we'll go into island settings and set the spawn limit to 2, set the total rounds to at least 10, and I set my time limit to off, set last standing ends game to on, set join in progress to spawn on next round, and set only allow respawn if spawn pads found to on. Now, if you start your game, you'll spawn, die after the explosive device goes off, and spawn in on the secondary spawn pad. Step 4. Now add another spawn pad next to the secondary and give it the same exact settings. This is where we use the Boxfight value, 1, and the Zone Wars value, 2. On your Boxfight spawn pad, quotation marks, which I colored the walls blue for this example, we want this spawn pad to be disabled when receiving from channel 2, which is the Zone Wars value. And we want to enable it if the round calls for Boxfight, which is value 1. The other Zone Wars spawn pad, which I colored red, works similarly, enabled from channel 2 and disabled from channel 1. Now if you start your game, you'll spawn in one of the two pads. Respawn a few times, sometimes you'll spawn on the same pad more than once in a row, but it should and will vary between the two pads. Now that we've conceptualized this with our big brains, we can actually make the rest of the map and put the spawns in the right areas. Step 5. We'll start with setting up the area for box fights. I've made mine 7 by 7, which is the blue floor you see here, and an extra row on each side, which is the red border. That's where we'll put the barriers. I've also made it 3 levels high, but that's more of a personal preference. You'll want to have 6 barriers, 1 trigger, and up to 16 spawn pads. We'll get to player inventory later on. Place this spawn pad as a secondary spawn pad, and we'll want to enable it from channel 1 and disable from channel 2. Now, in order to trigger our box fight features like the initial barriers and whatnot, we'll transmit on channel 5. Now you'll want to place your barriers. Outside of the box fight area, place it along the border 1 space from the edge, whatever side, the way I'm doing it here. Now you'll be placing several of these and you'll want them to overlap in a checkerboard pattern like so. Now this may vary depending on the dimensions of your box fight area, but if you're using a 7 by 7 box, set the width of the barrier to 15 and the height to 3 or however many levels high yours is. Also, set the zone shape to hollow in case it's overlapping a player spawn, and I generally like my barriers to have an appearance. Mine are blue force fields, thank you very much. Now, since we're only using these during box fights, set it to be enabled from channel 1 so they're there when your player spawns. Now we want these barriers to go away after giving everyone a few seconds to gather themselves. We'll use channel 6 for the signal to turn off these barriers. Now, nearby, you'll want to place your trigger. Turn triggered by player, vehicles, and sequencers to off. Set the delay to 5 seconds or however long you want your barriers to stay up before they disappear. I always turn off my sound and VFX. And since we transmit a signal on channel 5 when the player spawns in the box fight area, we'll have it set to trigger when receiving from channel 5. When this triggers, we want it to transmit a signal to disable the barriers, which we use channel 6 for. Now, if we start our game and test it, once we spawn in the box fight area, the barriers should be active when you spawn, and disable after 5 seconds have passed. Now we move on to step 6, the Zone Wars setup. For your Zone Wars area, you'll need up to 16 spawn pads, and a basic storm controller, unless you prefer advanced storms, that's up to you. I'm making my Zone Wars spawns as 2 by 1 boxes. After placing up to 16 of your Zone Wars spawn pads, set them as secondary pads, enabled during phase gameplay only, and for the channels, if you haven't guessed it yet, enable from channel 2 and disable from channel 1. Now the Zone Wars spawn in your map should be functional, but once our player spawns in the Zone Wars area, we want to send a signal to trigger our storm to appear, so we'll use channel 7 for that. Now, set up your storm controller wherever you want the circle to shrink to. Set generate on game start to no. We only want it to generate when this area's spawn pads signal it to do so. I set my initial radius to 300 meters as it was plenty, the end radius to 0 so it shrinks to nothing. I set the wait time to 5 seconds, the resize time to 1.5 to 2 minutes, whichever storm speed you're more comfortable with. The less time you set this to, the faster it moves. I set my delay time to 5 seconds, finish behavior to stay, and finally, generate storm when receiving from channel 7. Now, if you start your game, when the player spawns in the Zone Wars area, the storm should generate about 5 to 10 seconds after the game starts. Step 7. We'll start with the box fight area first. You'll need a class designer and a class selector. Place a class designer nearby, name your class Boxfights, and to keep our numbers consistent, set the class identifier to 1, and also grant ammo with weapons. Next, from the Creative Inventory tab, grab whatever weapons and heals, ammo and mats you want your players to have. The ones I've picked here in the video are considered standard for box fights. Then you just want to drop them all in front of the designer will pick them up, and then you're good to go. Place the class selector just underneath the floor in the center of the box fight area, how I do in the video. Set the class identifier to 1, time to switch to instant, clear items on switch to all items, Size of volume to 50 meters. If your area is bigger, you may need more class selectors because this only goes to 50 meters. You just want to make sure that the player spawns are inside of the volume. And if you do that, just use the same identifier number and the same settings and it should work fine. Also, set enabled during phase to gameplay. Now if you recall, for the Boxfight spawn pads, we use channel 5 to signal that the player has spawned in order to disable the barriers, so we can also use that signal here to change the player to this class when receiving from that channel. But real quick, before testing, go to your island settings and make sure your default class identifier is set to none. Now we'll go to the Zone Wars area, place a class designer nearby, name it Zone Wars and set it to identifier 2. And grant ammo with weapons, and obviously drop whatever weapons and heals, ammo, mats on it that you want, and then next we'll get to the class selector. You'll want to put it in the middle of all your player spawns, or spaced accordingly if you need to use multiple to cover more area. Always make sure the spawn pads are within the volume. The settings for this are all the same as the last one, and the channel we'll use here to trigger the switch to this class is channel 7, which is what we also use to activate the storm. Now you are close to having a fully functional, dynamic Zone Wars and Boxfights free-for-all map. Now we'll just go over all of our island settings to make sure you're set up properly for this. Just watch the screen and compare your island settings to mine to make sure that everything's all good to go. Unless you already know what you're doing ahead of time, there probably is some differences, so just have a look. Step 8. Now this part is optional, but I think it adds a nice touch. It does what you see here, lights up a button to show which one the next round will be. For each spawn box you'll need a billboard and 2 buttons. Place the billboard in front of the spawn pad and label it just like this. I also set mine to have this appearance so it makes the button color easier to see. Now place each button so that it's lined up with the text on either side. I get rid of the text on both buttons, but basically you set both buttons to be disabled at game start, and then set the Boxfight one to be enabled from channel 1, and set the Zone Wars one to be enabled from channel 2. This is a simple yet effective way to display to players what the next round will be a few seconds beforehand, so they can prepare their mental game or whatever. Step 9. Now this part is for anyone that prefers their box fights to have a shrinking zone. This is easy to add to our map. All you need is a basic storm controller. Go to your box fight area, and on top of it, right in the center, place the storm controller there. Set generate storm on game start to no. I set the size to 30 meters, end radius to 5 meters, wait time to 5 seconds, on finish behavior to stay, and generate storm from channel 6, which is what we use to disable the barriers once the box fight round starts. Once you've done this, you'll have a fully functional shrinking zone in your box fight area.